A note to the listener of this narration. The humble narrator is unable to read Greek text, and based on the limitation of time and budget for this project, I have needed to leave a few moments blank and simply said things like Greek words or Greek terms in place of Greek pronunciations. Your understanding is much appreciated, and I encourage you, if you are someone who does read Greek, to seek out a printed copy and find the passages in question. Thank you. Saving the Appearances, A Study in Idolatry, by Owen Barfield, 2nd edition. 14. Before and After the Scientific Revolution. For medieval man, then, the universe was a kind of theophany, in which he participated at different levels, in being, in thinking, in speaking or naming, and in knowing. And then the evolutionary change began. Not, of course, at any given moment, but with anticipation, localized delays, individual differences. But no beginning is instantaneous. Otherwise, the very word begin would be unnecessary and indeed meaningless. We need not pay too much attention to those historians who cautiously refuse to detect any process in history, because it is difficult to divide into periods, or because the periods are difficult to date precisely. The same objections apply to the process of growth from child to man. We should rather remind them that, if there is no process, there is in fact no such thing as history at all, so that they themselves must be regarded as mere chroniclers and antiquarians, a limitation which I cannot fancy they would relish. Moreover, the mental image, which they transfer to history, of a formless process determined by the chance impact of events, is itself, as we saw in Chapter 9, a product of the idolatry of the age of literalness. However this may be, and whatever chronological limits we choose to assign to it, a change there certainly was. Professor Barfield has commented well on it. Through changes in the habitual use of words, certain things in the natural philosophy of Aristotle had now acquired a coarsened meaning or were actually misunderstood. It may not be easy to say why such a thing should have happened, but men unconsciously betray the fact that a certain Aristotelian thesis simply has no meaning for them any longer. They just cannot think of the stars and heavenly bodies as things without weight, even when the books tell them to do so. Francis Bacon seems unable to say anything except that it is obvious that these heavenly bodies have weight, like any other kind of matter which we meet in our experience. Bacon says, furthermore, that he is unable to imagine the planets as nailed to crystalline spheres, and the whole idea only seems more absurd to him if the spheres in question are supposed to be made of that liquid, ethereal kind of substance which Aristotle had in mind. Between the idea of a stone aspiring to reach its natural place at the center of the universe, and rushing more fervently as it came nearer home, and the idea of a stone accelerating its descent under the constant force of gravity, there is an intellectual transition which involves a change in men's feeling for matter. We have seen that this change in men's feelings for matter is merely one aspect of a much deeper and more fundamental change. And the change in men's feeling for the nature of words and of thought was no whit less marked. Thus, the polarity of actus and potentia had carried perhaps half the weight of the philosophical thought of the Western mind through all the centuries that elapsed between Aristotle and Aquinas. A medieval philosopher would not have put the argument as I was obliged to do when I said in Chapter 3 that there is no such thing as unfelt solidity, just as there is no such thing as an unseen rainbow. He would have said that both the unseen rainbow and the unfelt matter are in potentia. Yet this polarity, taken for granted for more than 1,000 years by some of the acutest intellects the world has ever known, this polarity has become, for Bacon, a frigida distinctio, mere words, Again, in the Novum Organum, he tells men bluntly that they ought not to think of forms anymore. They are really more like laws. It may be that nothing really exists except individual bodies which produce real motion according to law. In science, it is just that law, and the inquiry, discovery, and explanation of it, which are the fundamental requisite both for the knowledge and for the control of nature. And it is that law and its clauses, which I mean when I use, chiefly because of its current prevalence and familiarity, the word forms. Causa exemplaris is gone, in other words, and mechanical causality and the idols are already in sight. If, with the help of some time machine working in reverse, a man of the Middle Ages could be suddenly transported into the skin of a man of the 20th century, seeing through our eyes and with our figuration the objects we see, I think he would feel like a child who looks for the first time at a photograph through the ingenious magic of a stereoscope. "Oh," he would say, "look how they stand out." We must not forget that in his time perspective had not yet been discovered, nor underrate the significance of this. True, it is no more than a device for pictorially representing depth and separateness in space. But how comes it that the device had never been discovered before, or, if discovered, never adopted? There were plenty of skilled artists, and they would certainly have hit upon it soon enough if depth in space had characterized the collective representations they wished to reproduce as it characterizes ours. They did not need it. Before the scientific revolution, the world was more like a garment men wore about them than a stage on which they moved. In such a world, the convention of perspective was unnecessary. To such a world, other conventions of visual reproduction, such as the nimbus and the halo, were as appropriate as to ours they are not. It was as if the observers were themselves in the picture. Compared with us, they felt themselves and the objects around them and the words that expressed those objects immersed together in something like a clear lake of, what shall we say, of meaning, if you choose. It seems the most adequate word. Aquinas' verbum intellectus was tanquam speculum, in quo rest sinitur, like a mirror in which the object is discerned. It happened that, at a time when I was studying the De Natura Verbi Intellectus, with that peculiar mixture of perplexity and delight which Thomas's sentences arouse, when his thinking is at its intensest and tersest, I had the good fortune to receive from a friend the gift of a volume of his own poems. It seemed to me then, and it still seems to me now, that in one of them he has managed, without setting out to do so, to convey more vividly than I could ever hope to do the qualitative difference between a participating outlook on the world and our own. I therefore conclude my chapter with it. Reflection. When hill, tree, cloud, those shadowy forms, ascending heaven are seen, their mindless beauty I from far admire a gulf between. Yet in the untroubled river when their true ideas I find, that river joined in trance with me becomes my second mind. George Rustrever, Hamilton, The Carved Stone, Heinemann, 1952. 15. The Greco-Roman Age, Mind and Motion. Earlier in this book, and particularly in Chapter 10, attention was drawn to the difference between a history of thought or of ideas, on the one hand, and a history of consciousness on the other. I am, of course, aware that the various expressions of medieval thought which I have discussed in the last two chapters are usually explained in quite a different way. Where I have treated them as arising out of and betokening a slightly different relation between the mind of man and his phenomena, and that itself as implying slightly different phenomena, the ordinary view regards them purely and simply as a different ideology superimposed on phenomena, which were in all respects the same as our own. By tracing this ideology through a chain of individual thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, the Neoplatonists, Galen, Isidore of Seville, Vincent de Beauvais, Martianus Capella, and others, the medieval outlook is presented as a stage in the history of, largely erroneous, ideas. Now, one outstanding thinker does, of course, pass on his ideas to others, and especially so in an age when books are few and hard to come by. There is, therefore, also a valid and significant history of ideas as such. But the irreconcilable conflict between the two approaches, if what we are seeking is a fundamentally adequate history of the human mind, becomes especially apparent when we look back, as I endeavor to do in the last chapter, on the ideas which the Western mind has formed in the past about this very question of its own relation to the phenomena, or, in other words, when we survey its theories of knowledge. We must then make our choice. The whole basis of epistemology from Aristotle to Aquinas assumed participation, and the problem was merely the precise manner in which that participation operated. We can either conclude that this persistent assumption was a piece of elaborate self-deception, which just happened to last not only from Aristotle, but from the beginnings of human thought down to the 15th or 16th century AD, or we can assume that there really was participation. I should find the second hypothesis the less fantastic of the two, even if it were not necessary, on other and quite unhistorical grounds, as I have suggested that it is, to accept participation as the permanent ground of our collective representations. It is to me rather too flattering a view to take of the philosophers not accepting even Aristotle, to regard them as the efficient and sufficient causes of collective representations shared by the greater part of Western humanity for nearly 20 centuries. From the point of view of a history of consciousness, their writings are rather landmarks to indicate the nature of that consciousness, inasmuch as they represent the human mind in its most wakeful state. At the same time, owing to the subtle link between thinking and figuration, and to the part played by language in evoking and sustaining the collective representations, they are by no means without causal significance. On either view, whether we choose to treat the history of the mind as a history of ideology or as a history of consciousness, we shall find that the continuity between Greek and medieval epistemology is far more striking than the break, and again, on either view, the language and the thought of Plato and Aristotle are the twin strands about which that continuity clusters. For the history of the mind, above all, when it is treated as a history of consciousness, the periods into which it is most convenient and most significant to divide the past history of mankind will not be those familiar ones which are adapted to a more superficial record. From the former point of view, the Greco-Roman period is seen as extending practically unbroken to the end of the Middle Ages. And beyond it, for the scientific revolution took some 3 or 4 centuries to accomplish completely, and participation died not suddenly, but by inches. It survived, for example, in chemistry longer than in the other sciences, and, after it had vanished altogether, not only from the sciences, but from the collective representations of the educated, or at least the urbanized part of mankind, its echo continues to survive in their habitual use of language for the purposes of thought. It is indeed only in our own time that we are witnessing its eviction from that final stronghold. We have already seen that logical predication was based by Aquinas on participation. It is not apparent to reflection that the validity of alpha thinking, insofar as it is based on logic, rests on that very participation which it tends by its operation to destroy. We can continue to apprehend phenomena as participating one another in a way which renders logical predication meaningful only as long as we continue to apprehend them as participated by ourselves. When that ceases, they become idols. And idols do not participate one another, nor are they connected in any necessary way with their names. They are simply there. Accordingly, the names cannot meaningfully be predicated of each other. In the logic of, for instance, John Stuart Mill, a certain residue of participation is still tacitly assumed. Where that has finally vanished and idolatry is total, species, genus, and the rest of them vanish as realities. Thus, early in the 20th century, formal logic begins to boggle much more heavily at the notion of predication, and really to feel the difficulty of distinguishing it from an assertion of numerical identity. Sooner or later, a Wittgenstein or an Ayer inevitably arises, convinced that all predication must be false or tautologous, a state of mind which was playfully foreshadowed by Plato more than 2,000 years ago in his dialogue, The Sophist. To this point of view, the belief that in the act of predication the mind is operating not only on words but on things themselves can only appear as a kind of survival of totemism. And that is indeed what it is, if for totemism we can substitute participation. The aim of the 3 preceding chapters was to characterize the collective representations of the period immediately preceding the scientific revolution, in the particular respect in which they differed most from our own. They were mainly illustrated from the close of that period in what are called the Middle Ages, but most of what was said applies with equal or greater force to the Greco-Roman age proper, in which the period began. As far as participation is concerned, the difference between medieval and Greek thought is one of degree rather than of kind, and I shall limit myself to a very few observations on the latter. In the first place, there are strong indications in the Greek language and elsewhere, apart altogether from philosophy, that the participation of the ordinary man was a livelier and more immediate experience. The gods and nature spirits of Greek mythology, and, in particular, the whole Dionysian element in the cults, linked man and nature in a unity which, for a very good reason, could not, as we shall see, and did not survive the impact of Christianity. But apart from religion, if we are attentive to the nuances of the Greek language, we shall find many signs of a living participation in nature, especially perhaps the nature of man's own bodily processes, of which we today know next to nothing. I feel, moreover, that the superlative quality of Greek sculpture at its height must be attributed to that participation rather than to any mere excellence in the craft of meticulous imitation. At the philosophical level, we may reflect from this point of view on the very title of that work of Aristotle from which Aquinas quotes more freely than from any other. In English it is On the Soul. In Latin, De Anima. But in Greek, it is 2 Greek words and 1 Greek word translated psyche. My apologies, the narrator is unable to read Greek text. Psyche was in Greek the word for life as well as for soul. Again, there is a sinewy quality in Aristotle's Greek words and Greek words nous poeticus and nous patheticus, which has already faded somewhat from their Latin equivalents intellectus agens and intellectus possibilis. The nous of which Aristotle spoke and thought was clearly less subjective than Aquinas' intellectus, and when he deals with the problem of perception, he polarizes not merely the mind, but the world itself, without explanation or apology, into 2 verbs and Greek word, poien and pashin, to do and to suffer. In the psychological and epistemological contexts in which he employs them, these 2 words alone are as untranslatable as the mentality which they reveal is remote from our own. It is, for instance, not possible to equate them with the Aristotelian matter and form, though matter is certainly passive and form active. For in the process of perception, he tells us, it is the percept which is active, and the perceiving organism which is passive. The organ of perception is potentially what the percept already is actually. It suffers something unlike itself, but in doing so becomes like what it suffers. The actualization of percept and of perception are one and the same thing. When we come to thinking, on the other hand, as distinct from perceiving, while it is the passive mind, nous patheticus, which gives us our subjectivity, it is the active mind, nous poeticus, which is operative in the act of knowing. The soul is poien, to the body's paschine. But soul and body together are, except in the act of knowing, nous patheticus. Alike in perceiving and in thinking, there is an active and passive movement, and in both cases the second is the field for the activity of the first. All these complex movements, which are the very stuff of human nature, may be conceived of as potential knowledge. Actual knowledge occurs when man becomes wakefully aware of them, for then, Greek sentence, mind becomes what it thinks and may be said to know itself. If this kind of psychology was really as tenuous, fine-drawn, and obscure, or to use Bacon's word, as frigid as it seems to most people today, it is difficult to explain why, for so many centuries, so many people found it exciting. The true explanation is, once more, that we have lost half the meanings of the key words in which it is expressed. Above all, with the disappearance of participation, words to do with thinking and perceiving and words to do with movement and space have parted company. Aristotle's poiein and paschine were for him not the insubstantial semi-mystical abstractions which we make of them, when we translate them active principle and passive principle. They were at the same time respectively Greek word and Greek word, to move and to be moved. Locomotion, or traction, was for the Greek philosophers only one kind of movement, which included also change, growth, and decay. And the kinesis, to which Aristotle refers in so many different contexts, was simply not what we mean by movement at all, who think of it as the bare change of position of an idol in Newtonian space. If we would gain some idea not only of what movement meant before the scientific revolution, but also of that, to us, either foolish or baffling tendency to connect pure thought somehow with space, which we have already observed in the case of Plato's astronomy, we shall find it more pronounced and explicit in the thought of Plato and his predecessors than in that of Aristotle and his successors. In the Theaetetus, for instance, Plato tells us that for Heraclitus and his followers, poiein and paschine, let me now call them action and passion, were the two primary kinds of kinesis, and that it is out of them that sense perception arises. Each of the two was again subdivided into swift and slow. What we call the object was slow action, and what we call the subject, slow passion, while what we call the quality of the object was swift action, and what we call sensation, swift passion. It is with such images in our minds that we should read Plato himself when he maintains elsewhere that through perception we share or participate in the process of coming into being. It is with such images in our minds that we should seek to interpret, if we really wish to enter it, the thought of Aristotle and the philosophy and science of the Middle Ages in which so much of that thought lived on. As to the relation between thought and space, it is almost sufficient to read Timaeus, which incidentally was the principal channel through which the thinking of Plato and his predecessors was known to the Middle Ages. In this dialogue, Plato describes the world as a moving image of eternity. It is, however, not simply a matter of a few revealing uses of key words, though of these there are enough to spare. As when he tells us that of the 7 different kinds of movement, movement in a circle is, Greek words, the one that has most to do with mind and understanding. Or again, that by contemplating the undisturbed revolutions of mind in the heavens, we may make use of them for the revolutions of our own intellect, which, though disturbed, are nevertheless akin to the former. It is rather that the whole development and structure of thought in the dialogue is such that celestial astronomy and metaphysics are inextricably one. In the metaphysical discussion of the problem of the one and the many, of identity and difference, which Plato here names same and other, the abstract notion of sameness is indistinguishable from the circle of the same, namely the celestial equator, and the abstract notion of difference is indistinguishable from the circle of the other, namely the ecliptic, where the planets wander and change. We have already seen that even in the Middle Ages, man's experience of space was clearly different from our own, and the old tendency to experience as one what we now distinguish absolutely as mind, on the one hand, and space, on the other, still finds an echo in the Divine Comedy, especially when in the 10th canto of the Paradiso, Dante refers to the celestial revolution as quanto per mente o per loco si gira, whatsoever revolves through the mind or space. The impression we get, however, is that it was by then already a good deal nearer to our own than the Greek experience. It is interesting in this connection to observe how Aristotle selects for criticism precisely that astronomical metaphysics to which I have just referred, maintaining that the oneness or self-identity of nous ought not to be conceived spatially, but only numerically, and that accordingly the circles of which Plato speaks in the Timaeus must be ruled out when we are treating of psychology. The proper movement of a circle is revolution, but the proper movement of mind, he insists, is thinking. This detachment of the idea of thought, first from the idea of movement in space, and then from the idea of movement of any sort, must have been no small feat. It was the beginning of true beta thinking. Here we may well pause for a moment to refer back to Harvey's discovery of the circulation of the blood. It will be remembered from Chapter 12 that this was based on the perfection of circular motion and on the formal relation between microcosm and macrocosm. Here, then, is a striking example of the diminishing experience of participation. First, the great circles of the macrocosm are abstracted by Aristotle from the movement of mind and conceived as more purely spatial, and then, much later, this very abstraction facilitates a mechanomorphic conception of the movement of the blood. Later still, this conception of the blood plays its part in obliterating from consciousness the whole relation of microcosm to macrocosm on which it was based. Although Aristotle was the pupil of Plato, there are many good reasons for treating the former as beginning a new epoch, and the latter as closing an old one, while not forgetting that all such exact limitations of period have about them something artificial and arbitrary. At some point, a thing ceases to be flower and becomes fruit, but who shall say exactly when? In Raphael's fresco of the School of Athens in the Vatican, the two figures of Plato and Aristotle stand side by side, the one with raised hand pointing upwards to the heavens, the other pointing earthward down a flight of steps. If, in imagination, we take our stand between the two, we can indeed look forward through the thinking which found expression in Aristotle to the collective representations of the Western world which were to take their course, through the so-called Dark and Middle Ages down to the Scientific Revolution and beyond. While through the other, through the star and space-involved thinking of Plato, we may peer backward into the collective representations of the East and of the past. The cosmogony of Plato was still in the Pythagorean stream, and the tradition that Pythagoras visited India, whether in itself it be legendary or historical, is a convenient expression of a process which is apparent from internal evidence. It is many years now since Max Müller pointed to a number of coincidences between the philosophy of Plato and the Upanishads, among them the concept of reincarnation, but added that he thought any actual contact unlikely. But if what has been said in this book, particularly Chapter 10, is correct, the progress of ideas has been as much or more a function of the evolution of consciousness than its vehicle. That is, of consciousness and its correlative, the phenomena or collective representations. Accordingly, that evolution is much less dependent on contacts or communications than has generally been supposed. When we consider, as is here being attempted, the evolution of consciousness as the progressive decline of participation, the emergence of the Greek from the ancient Oriental outlook is a fact which we can contemplate without being unduly troubled by the absence of biographical details about Pythagoras. Anyone who has struggled for a few pages with the Vedas in translation will know that in their language the entanglement of subject and object, of psychology and natural history, of divine and human, of word and thing, is such as to render the thought virtually unintelligible to a modern reader, though of course he can make some kind of sense of it by paraphrasing it into moralizing abstractions of his own. To take only one instance, the word namarupa, or name form, takes us back straight away to the stage of consciousness at which that surgical operation to which I referred in Chapter 13, whereby the thing is separated from its name, had not yet begun to be performed. In the measure that man participates his phenomena, in that measure the name is the form, and the form is the name. At this point, however, that is, with the emergence of Greek thought, so far as it was platonically inclined, from the hitherto almost wholly religious consciousness of the Orient, I propose to end the movement of this book in the direction of the past and turn its face once more toward the present. To do otherwise would, in the first place, require an acquaintance with Oriental language which I do not possess. But there is another reason. The kind of consciousness which I have hitherto attempted to depict, though characterized by a participation which we lack, is at least, as it were, within sight of our own. We can, or so I have thought, catch glimpses of it which are describable, though with difficulty, in the idol-infected language which the scientific revolution has bequeathed to us. But to depict the kind of consciousness which prevailed at still earlier periods requires, it seems to me, a different method and a different terminology. It may well also demand the extension of historical imagination into a manner of clairvoyance. My purpose is the humbler one of establishing, in the language and imagery of every day, the bare fact that there has been an evolution of consciousness. And if that is possible at all, it is possible within the limits of Pythagoras and Moses.